Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Green Carmichael from Bloomberg Opinion. I am our managing editor for politics, and we're here today to talk about the big, beautiful bill, or the House Reconciliation Budget Bill. I'm here today with David M. Drucker, a Bloomberg columnist and senior writer at the Dispatch, and Malika Henderson, who's Bloomberg's columnist covering politics out of Washington. And we're going to start today with doing a little bit of a gut check on this massive bill, which is projected to cost about 3.8 to 5 trillion over 10 years, depending on a few details, adding that sum to our already exploding national debt. And Trump wants to get it all done in a month before July 4th. Nia, how realistic is that timeline? Does that seem realistic to you?
Listen, I'm going to bet on Trump. I'm going to bet on Trump's hold over the Republican Party. He had to knock some heads, and not that many heads in the House to get it through there. And this is his deadline. He wants to get it done very quickly. You hear from some Republicans that they have some problems with some of the Medicaid cuts, as well as some on the other side want bigger cuts to the social safety net. But if you listen closely, there are not that many that are complaining, right? Maybe there are 4 or 5 or so. And it feels like this is kind of the drama before they fold, as we saw, I think, in the House that eventually ended up happening. And listen, some of this is Trump's power over his party, but some of this is just the way that Washington works. It is very rare you can find instances where individual members or a group of members will try to tank such a big policy initiative and policy goal of a sitting president of their own party. And so I think that history in Trump's bullying, quite frankly, and his pulpit will push this over the end to the July 4th, and Trump can have a big ceremony on July 4th. I guess it won't be Liberation Day. It'll be obviously Independence Day, but it'll be Big Beautiful Bill Day, and I think he'll get what he wants.
David, you had mentioned in a piece out this morning, the fiscal hawks who in theory could derail this bill are very lonely voices now on the Hill. And it does strike me that this bill is adding a huge amount to the federal debt. You see the bond market seems to be a little bit worried about it. We did a bunch of stimulus spending during COVID, which was an emergency. Is there a particular reason to add more to the debt now? And why has the Republican Party kind of just shifted away from caring about the debt?
Yeah, well, look, a couple of issues there, but look, as always, these things are subjective, right? It's important to the president and to many Republicans who historically have looked at tax cuts as growth engines for the economy to extend the expiring tax cuts from the 2017 overhaul of the tax code that Trump signed into law. And so you have that. And then he campaigned on a number of sort of working class, middle class tax cuts, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime pay, to name a few. And so you put that all together and you have this sort of popular menu of tax breaks that the president wants to deliver on, and that Republicans have always felt good about legislating. The issue, as you mentioned, is that the federal debt is so much higher than it has ever been, both just the dollar amount, but also as a percentage of GDP, because of all the spending we did during COVID, which was an emergency. And we're beginning to see, if not, retail market issues, we're definitely seeing bond market hesitation, right? I mean, I woke up a couple of days ago, and my Bloomberg headline was that a couple of firms had decided they're not interested in purchasing long-term U.S. bonds, 30-year U.S. bonds. These are the sorts of things that's going to make it harder for us to sustain the debt. It's going to raise the interest rates that we pay for the debt, which raises interest rates for consumers, which makes it harder for investment. And that gets us to, so why aren't Republicans doing anything about this? Well, in part, it's because they'd have to make a lot of unpopular choices. They'd have to drastically cut spending. They'd have to overhaul Medicare and Social Security. And nobody wants to touch that. And where the Republican Party was once at least at least they'd sort of pay lip service to it, or they would talk about doing it or say how it was necessary to do. This is now not really a party where the heart of the base of the party are grassroots conservatives that are concerned about debt and deficit and spending. The grassroots sort of base of the party is concerned about culture and cultural issues. And Trump, by luring so many former Democrats into the party, working class, rank and file union members, and not just white, but now black and Hispanic. These are people that never had an issue with government spending that the Democrats wanted to do or did do, right? They took issue. They left the Democratic Party because of cultural issues, whether it's abortion, whether it's gun rights. Now we talk a lot about trans girls in women's sports. These are things that have motivated that shift, but they've brought with them their sort of liberal economics. And Trump has never been at his core a small government, no debt guy. And so the party now reflects him. And so do many Republicans in Congress. There are so many Republicans that have been elected since 2016 that now follow Trump's lead. And so there's the mix of all of that, right? A different party. It would be hard to do what's necessary to do. And then it's delivering on what the president campaigned on.
Yeah, yeah. So not a huge constituency there for the pain of austerity, and I guess
None.
the bond market doesn't vote. So
they'll have a vote eventually, and some president's going to have to deal with it, whether this one or a future one.
Yeah. And so if that's the state of play among oh, go ahead, Nia. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, and part of the culture issue that's embedded in this bill that is a real policy priority of rank and file Republicans has to do with immigration. Trump promised mass deportation. He doesn't have the money really to do it. And part of this bill is funding that effort, building the wall bigger, better, more beautiful as well. And so, again, I think it's going to be that attracts some of those both rank and file Republicans, some of those disaffected Democrats as well, and then those former deficit and debt hawks who are in the Congress. In terms of Democrats, right? Democrats see this as an opportunity. They feel like this is essentially a wealth transfer, that you are going to take away benefits from the least among us, lower income Americans who rely on the social safety net to get health care, for their children to get health care, for their children to get food, the SNAP benefits, for instance. That those are going to be cut, and there is going to be a transfer of wealth and revenue to the upper income Americans, to top 1%, the top 10%. So that is the messaging, and I think that the hope for Democrats also is that the average American really doesn't feel this, right? That there is no real material effect on the average Americans in terms of a benefit, right? That there will be some Americans who obviously, unfortunately, suffer because of this bill. They'll message on that. But then there is the kind of, okay, so we transferred this benefit to upper income earners. And Americans, the average American is still struggling with grocery prices. The average American still can't move into their dream home or move out of their starter home into their dream home. And so I think that is what you see. And listen, I think the problem Democrats have is that this has been a message for the Democratic Party for many, many cycles. The idea that Republicans favor the rich at the expense of the middle class and lower income Americans. And so in that way, there is a risk of sort of shouting the same message into the void. But listen, I think if you're looking at the midterms, I think because the midterms are the midterms, they usually go the way of the party out of power. The president usually loses seats. I think there's a net gain of like 3 that Democrats have to make on the House side to flip the House. That seems doable. the Senate is a steeper climb because of the way that the Senate is just structured in some of the changes we've seen in the demographics in this coalition that the Democrats have lost and the Republicans have gained. But yeah, I mean, I think you've heard so far the messaging from Democrats has been pretty consistent, and they think it'll be a winning one. And they also just think average Americans will either be hurt by this or not really helped at all. So what's all the fuss about? Why, in the end, did you explode the deficit, blow a hole in the revenue that the government takes in? I think it'll be like $40 billion a hole in terms of revenue that the government won't see over the next 10 years. So those are kind of the talking points I think that we'll see over the next many months around this.
Yeah, I mean, David, what are your thoughts on kind of the Democratic attempts to stop this bill? I mean, it does seem like the messaging here is very, as Nia pointed out, very similar to previous sort of Democratic messaging. And the Democratic Party could hardly be less popular right now. So do you think they're doing an effective job?
There's not much they can do. They don't have the numbers. I mean, right, we're running a reconciliation package, which means you can't filibuster it in the Senate, and the House is always a majority rule. So as long as Republicans stay unified or unified enough, Democrats can do nothing but message against this, hope to anger voters and get payback next year, as Nia was referencing. But I think the other thing here is that the Republican Party's populism makes this harder for the Democrats to message. And I mean it in this way. I mean, there are a lot of tax breaks that would be extended or expanded for corporations, for high earners, obviously upping the SALT deduction, which primarily impacts the working wealthy, the sort of upper middle class and the wealthy is there. But as I mentioned before, and this really appealed to a lot of middle class and working class voters, eliminating the income tax on tips, eliminating the income tax on overtime pay, creating this new tax break for seniors on Social Security, creating a new tax deduction for American-made cars that are being financed. There are things in there for Republicans to message. And then on the Senate side, you've got Josh Hawley, who's an ally of the president, who is a cultural conservative, and everybody thinks of him as Josh Hawley, the conservative, and he's the one saying he's not voting for any Medicaid cuts. And so because the Republican numbers in the House are the majority is small, the margins are thin, the few deficit hawks that are there had to be lured to support the bill with these changes to Medicaid that would reduce benefits, that would have a negative impact on a lot of not just poor Americans, but middle-class Americans, because under Obamacare, Medicaid was expanded. And here you have Josh Hawley in the Senate saying, I'm not voting for this if you stick with these Medicaid cuts. So my point is that the messaging for Democrats isn't as clean as it used to be, because you can listen to a Democrat saying these Medicaid cuts are evil, and then you can listen to Republicans like Josh Hawley saying these Medicaid cuts are evil. And let's say you're in a deep red state like Missouri that he represents, and you might be inclined to get angry at Republicans for wanting to cut the Medicaid you use, but your U.S. senator, who's a rather prominent figure, is not just a House member in some corner of the state, is on TV saying, I'm fighting against Medicaid cuts. In fact, just the other day, you know how this goes with Trump. Trump told me he is against these Medicaid cuts. And so it's just a different sort of argument. We're not having the traditional argument where Democrats talk about how vulnerable people will be impacted by spending cuts and reforms, and Republicans are talking about debt reduction and the need to protect the economy and growth. This is really an argument about who's better at giving people stuff that they need or like or want. And and I think the politics of this has to be seen in that context.
So speaking of non-traditional arguments, I think we need to take a little detour and talk about Joni Ernst for a minute, who has gotten so much heat for basically making the argument that Medicaid cuts don't matter because we're all going to die eventually. I mean, this is an argument that if you had said to me 5 or 10 years ago, Joni Ernst would be making this argument, I'm not sure I would have believed you. And then she doubled down on it with this very strange video where she then kind of mocked people who criticized her for this. And, also in a deep red state, similar to Josh Hawley. Nia, I wondered if you had thoughts on that kind of moment that exploded over the weekend.
Well, listen, they played her comeback video on air yesterday on one of the networks, and I had to turn the TV down because it was such a cringe moment. I didn't want to have such prominent secondhand embarrassment. And so I've heard about her response, but I couldn't bear to actually listen to it. Listen, Joni Ernst is in a tough,
awkward
tough
British humor
place.
that makes you just disappear. Yeah.
Yeah. The camera, everything was just, please, let's not say we did. So she's in a tough spot, right? She's up for re-election. She got in the crosshairs of MAGA and Donald Trump around Pete Hegseth, and it wasn't a very comfortable place to be for Joni Ernst. And now she is having to go to Iowa and sell this bill, which will make cuts. And it will make cuts to people she represents in terms of Medicaid, because a lot of rural Americans depend on Medicaid. And that is the kind of state, Iowa, with a lot of Trump voters, the MAGA base that somebody like Steve Bannon has talked about and said, listen, be careful when it comes to these Medicaid cuts, because a lot of MAGA is on Medicaid. Listen, I think they're going to try to reframe it as this is about waste, fraud, and abuse. It's a whole lot of waste, fraud, and abuse that they have supposedly cut in this, but you can see them trying with this messaging, the Republicans saying, well, this is going to be people who don't deserve. They're sort of the non-deserving poor, the non-deserving people who are in this country without documentation, for instance. So listen, I think somebody like Josh Hawley will eventually get on board and be part of the messaging around this bill. But you see Joni Ernst not quite ready for the kind of questions that she was going to get from people in that audience. And listen, we don't know if those were MAGA voters. We don't know if they were Democratic voters. The point is that they backed her into a corner that she wasn't ready for. And her response was, well, we're all going to die eventually, which of course made the front page of the local papers, And listen, in another era, that might be enough to, drive somebody, not necessarily drive somebody not to run, but to make a race more competitive. And I think in a state like Iowa, Joni Ernst is on pretty solid footing, given the demographics of that state, as well as the damaged brand of the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Funny, Mike Johnson has had a kind of interestingly unusual message as well, which is he's really said that like a big part of the problem is like young men on Medicaid who are playing video games. That's kind of a bizarre message, both because I think Republicans have tried so hard to win over the manosphere, presumably which a big part is young men playing video games, but also that doesn't really seem to comport with the facts of who is going to be most affected by these cuts. So you have all kinds of interesting messages kind of flying around here. And I feel like we would be remiss if we did not talk a little bit in this section on wavering votes about Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who have become sort of the maverick-iest members of the Republican Senate. David, do you think that they will be holdouts on this, or do you think they'll fall in line as they often do on very large priorities for the party?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think Susan Collins is more likely to fall in line than Lisa Murkowski. I mean, Lisa Murkowski, on issues that she wants to vote for, and occasionally when she's being pragmatic, she votes for them. And when she doesn't like something, she doesn't. Susan Collins is more inclined to, and she does this very well, right? She doesn't like something. She's concerned about something. She's doing her homework on something. All right, I've gotten guarantees about something. Okay, I'm going to vote for it. And look, she's got
and maybe a big speech is involved as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, she is so talented at doing this, and she's so good at just reflecting Maine, right? I mean, if you I don't want to get too far afield here, but if you look at Jared Golden, the Democrat who represents the very Trumpy 2nd District of Maine in the House, right, a very centrist, moderate Democrat who occasionally will be with his party, but then won't be. But the way he talks about it and explains himself, he used to work for Susan Collins. So Susan Collins, I could imagine, in fact, I would probably predict eventually comes around to supporting this bill one way or the other. I think Murkowski is more of an open question. I'm also going to be interested to see what Mitch McConnell does. I think he supports it because I think he wants John Thune to succeed, even if he has issues with the bill. Tom Tillis is got a tightrope because North Carolina is competitive, even though Democrats often fall short, but it is truly competitive. But Tom Tillis cannot be on the wrong side of a Republican primary challenger. And that means he cannot be on the wrong side of Donald Trump. I would, sort of caution everybody that I believe this bill will pass. Sarah, as you know, I wrote that. But I don't yet know if we know the final version of the bill. I could see the Senate saying, this is what we want, and send it back to the House, and we can have some ping-ponging throughout the summer. I think Nia, I wouldn't argue against Nia on the July 4th deadline. My unofficial thinking deadline has been the beginning of the August recess, at the end of July, beginning of August. So I think there's more unknowns to work out here with this bill, although I do eventually think it'll cross the finish line.
Well, and David, you also wrote that you sort of predicted that there would be that this is the only thing they're really going to get done before the midterms. They've shoehorned everything into this bill because they're not going to have something else to take to voters. And that's a little bit surprising given that Republicans do control both houses of Congress and the White House. Can you just explain kind of why you think this is kind of it? They're just putting all their marbles. I guess I was going to mix a metaphor. They're putting all their chips on one square.
Yeah, they're putting all the cheese on one plate of nachos, right? Or something like that. Look, Nia, I was glad Nia brought up the border security component of the reconciliation package. So this is another carrot to get you to swallow all the stuff that maybe, you might have issues with if you thought about it. I think one of the things driving this is they don't want to negotiate with Senate Democrats, which would necessitate, in a way, negotiating with House Democrats. So the more you do in reconciliation, the more you can do, even though there are limitations, because under the law, not everything can be dealt with in reconciliation. It just means you don't have to haggle. It's one of the reasons why this debt ceiling increase, which is a huge debt ceiling increase designed to last through the balance of the Trump second term, is in here because Democrats would drive a really hard bargain to join Republicans in raising the debt ceiling, which has to be done sometime this summer. So I think a large part of the reason why they're throwing everything in here is simply so that they can do what they want without having to negotiate with the other side. But it does put them in a bit of a bind in that if this thing were to fail, then Republican voters would hold not Trump accountable, they would hold congressional Republicans accountable. And they really wouldn't see any reason to show up next year when Trump's not on the ballot. And look, Republican voters don't like congressional Republicans all that much. They like Trump, right, and they like congressional Republicans if they're doing what Trump wants, but they still remain suspicious and unhappy with a lot of Republicans in Congress. Look, I would make the argument that if you were legislating and working with Democrats on a number of different issues and showing work product, it would redound to your benefit. But we just haven't seen a lot of movement other than to focus on reconciliation. And, for instance, the continuing resolution to keep the lights on in the government from earlier this year, that was a must-pass bill. And the fact that they're putting border security into the reconciliation package rather than trying to do, even if it was in pieces, more expansive border security measures that would last, is another thing that kind of tells you where this party is. They're allowing and relying on Donald Trump to do everything he can through executive order, even though this stuff is ephemeral. And if a Democrat's elected in 2028, 90% of this stuff's going to go away. But it's what they've chosen to do. but it's also why I think this bill will end up passing at the end of the day.
Yeah. And it's ephemeral, but it sure feels good, right? It feels good to
Sugar
the
high.
base, and some of this, sort of the cultural shifts. Maybe it's ephemeral, maybe it's not. I mean, maybe he really is changing approach to transgender girls, approach to DEI. You think about the massive cuts that have been made to the federal government, that workforce, and driving out expertise. I'm not sure that's going to be ephemeral. I think a lot of that stuff is going to be hard to for a Democrat to come in, in 4 years and really change the roles and ranks of government workers. So listen, I think if you're an average Republican, you probably feel pretty good about what Donald Trump is doing. We'll see what happens with tariffs, with the price of milk and a loaf of bread at the Piggly Wiggly. But for now, this is a president who has delivered to his base in record time, in a way that I think was a real shock to the system, and will continue to be, reorganizing not only global trade, reorganizing America's relationship, realigning America's relationship to the world. That is, I don't think that's ephemeral. I mean, I think this is gonna have a real long tail for years to come.
Mm. Well, that seems like a good place to leave it for today. And we could be back in a month saying, the bill has passed, or we could be back in a month saying the bill has fallen apart. So stay tuned. But for now, that's all for today. Thank you all so much for joining us.
See you.